Being a full-time photographer or creative does not mean that you have to be a starving artist. Today, I am sharing everything I made during my best year yet as a brand photographer. However, I am also going to share how much it costs to run my photography business and the entire lead up that it took me to get from my first year in business to my best year in business as a six-figure photographer. So hello and welcome to the Profitable Creatives Podcast. I am Emily Kim, and today we are diving into something I'm always a little bit nervous to share. I have done a Facebook Live on this. I've done a YouTube video on this, but the response is always great because it's something that I don't think a lot of people are really sharing, and I mean really sharing about when it comes to running a creative service-based business. I think we've all seen those posts from like educators and coaches who are like, I just had my first 50K month, or how I went from 0 to $1 million in just 6 months. You know, those kinds of things, which, on one hand, amazing. I am so happy for you. Like, that is really, truly amazing. But I don't think that paints the whole picture of how that happened, right? Like, okay, in 6 months you made whatever money, but nobody's really talking about, well, what were you doing before those 6 months? Because I don't think we came out of the womb like knowing how to do this kind of stuff, right? And again, don't get me wrong. Those are amazing numbers and an amazing story, but that's not my story. So that's what we're going over today. So in this episode, you can expect to hear my story, my numbers. I am literally going to read to you my profit and loss statement from some of these years, okay? And we're going to talk about the learnings, trials, and things that I wish I did differently along the way. So when I first started my business in 2018, I was pretty clueless as to what running a successful business actually looked like. Clueless in terms of the numbers, in terms of how I should be spending my time, really all of it. And I think this is the case for a lot of us where we start our businesses because we're doing something we like. I was taking pictures on the side. I had my quote unquote fancy camera. And then all of a sudden someone was like, Emily, can I give you $30 to photograph my recital photos? And I said, okay, $30, that's 2 dinners. To a college kid, that's like amazing, right? But $30 is not going to pay my bills. I think one thing to keep in mind as you're listening to this episode is thinking about what are your goals. If your goal is to maintain your business as a side hustle, what you want versus what someone whose goal is to become full-time in their business is going to look very different. So at this time, I was running it as a side hustle, and my goal was, side hustle money. At the end of 2018, my first year as a registered business, I ended up making $12,000 in gross revenue, so in total sales that I brought in. However, I only profited $6,000. So after expenses, after gear purchases, after any travel or Ubers or anything like that, I brought home $6,000. And let me tell you, this was great news for me at the time because it was a side hustle. I was like, oh, $6,000, that covers my equipment. Like, how awesome. I have this hobby that I can, pay for the equipment that I want. But it was also around this time that I started meeting full-time photographers and thinking like, oh, I didn't know that this was possible. So on one hand, I was excited because as side income money, that was great. But on the other hand, I was like, okay, $6,000, I can't quit my job with that kind of money. So let's just try again. We'll try again next year. Another thing to keep in mind at this point in time in 2018, I was not keeping track of my numbers at all. I had a spreadsheet that I would update, but it wasn't combined with my expenses or anything. And it wasn't until the end of the year at tax time that I ran a profit and loss statement for the first time, where I looked at all of my revenue. I looked at all of my expenses. I put it into TurboTax, which is what I was using at the time, and said, okay, I guess I made $6,000. I recommend knowing your numbers. We'll get into that. But I didn't know at the time. It wasn't until the end of the year that I ever figured it out. I think another funny thing about this is I mentioned in the last episode that I have my MBA, and business 101 is literally look at your profit and loss statement. That's the first thing that you do in business school. But I was so concerned with my gear and with my technique and becoming a better photographer and all the photography side of things and never the business side of things. I was scared to look at my own numbers because that felt like it made it less fun, right? So if you are feeling the same way and you're like, oh, yeah, I don't really like to look at that, I totally understand you. As someone who self-identifies to be good with numbers and a mathy person, I have a degree in computer science. It's very mathy. I totally avoided looking at my numbers because I was too in my head and too scared to look at them because then that would mean something, right? Me not making as much money as I thought or, being in the red or in the negative meant that I wasn't a good business owner. So I would just ignore it. And that's what I did for a couple of years. So that is 2018. 2019 rolls around. This is my first full calendar year where I have a registered business. And at the beginning of the year, I said to myself, okay, Emily, it's time to step it up. Like if you ever want to even think about running this business full time, we got to change something. So I revamped my website. I got a new logo. The whole shebang. I started taking brand photos around this time. I was doing any kind of assistant gig, any kind of second shooting gig. Anything that came my way, I took it. I said yes. And you know what? In 2019, I did double my revenue. I went from $12,000 in revenue to $28,000 in gross revenue. But I still only profited $14,000 because the rest went to business expenses. So that's progress, right? I doubled my revenue, but that is still nowhere near enough to live on, especially with the amount of time that I was spending in my business. I was spending weekends, early mornings before work, late afternoons between 5 and 8 before the sunset doing photos. The amount of money that I made did not nearly cover the amount of time that I was spending in my business. And at the end of 2019, I was still not looking at my profit and loss statement. I did not know month to month how much money I was making. If you are not looking at your profit and loss statement on a regular basis, I like to compare it to driving a car blindfolded because you really don't know what's going on in your business until you are looking at this regularly. So I mentioned in my last episode, around this time at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020 is the first time that I started working with a business mentor. I was really having trouble wrapping my brain around selling and sales calls, and she really helped me work through that. I could record a whole separate episode on the importance of hiring a mentor, but that's for later. But in any case, just know that this was key in changing my mindset around looking at my numbers. It was still scary, but it really did help me. So then 2020 rolls around. We all know what happened. But like I mentioned in my previous episode, this was a huge driver for my business because all of a sudden, everybody needed to be online. Entrepreneurs needed to be online. So my inquiries for brand photography really started going up. I also had more flexibility in working from home. I no longer had to go into the office to work my full-time software engineering job. So if I needed to take a meeting during lunch, it was a lot easier for me to do that. I had a little bit more time for shoots because I wasn't commuting. So at the end of 2020, I grossed $50,000 in sales. So my business brought in $50,000. But I made about $24,000 in profit. So again, around 50% of the money that came in went towards expenses. Throughout the entirety of my business, I tend to maintain around a 50% profit margin, which is fine for me. Yours might look different, but that's just what has been working for me. So again, I almost doubled my revenue, but yet still not enough to quit my day job. And at this point, by 2021, I was reaching my breaking point at my full-time job. I realized that this job wasn't aligned with my goals, my priorities, and my mental health was taking a serious toll doing this and also running my brand photography business, right? There was no time for me. I knew something had to change. And throughout pretty much all of 2020, if I go back and look at my journal, I can see the journal entries of me saying, like, I think I want to quit my job. I think I want to try running my business full time. How the heck am I going to do that when I'm not bringing in this money, right? So it was something that was on my brain all the time. My original plan was to leave my corporate job only when I had replaced my salary with brand photography income, or by 2025, whichever came first. On this trajectory, that would have allowed me to leave at 2023 if my photography business was growing at the same rate. But as you know, that didn't actually happen. I actually quit my job in June of 2021. And the reason why is because I had reached a point where I could no longer generate any more money. I couldn't take on any more shoots. I couldn't market myself anymore with the existing time that I had available. I had to either decide, am I going to keep doing this and running myself ragged, running my business at the rate that I am, or am I going to quit my job? Because, as you know, photography is a one-to-one service, and I had maxed out. So this is kind of where divine timing, the universe decided to step in, I like to say, because at this point, in addition to quitting my job, one of my dreams was also to open a photography studio. Because as a brand photographer, it's just so much more convenient when you have your own place. If you want a whole episode on studio, all things studio, let me know. But I wanted my own studio for myself and that I could rent out to other photographers because the closest studio that I would go to was like 40 minutes away. That's just a lot of commute time. I really don't like to be commuting. So this was my dream. And I had talked about it with my mentor. It was something that we wrote down and she said, I think this might come sooner than you think. And I laughed in her face and said, what the heck are you talking about? Turns out she was right. So because I was talking to her about this, one night I was just, checking my business email, doing businessy things. And I said, it wouldn't hurt if I started planning for this now. Let me just look and see what is the process like for renting commercial spaces. What does that even look like? So I go online, I find this website, and I see a beautiful 800 square foot space that's less than 10 minutes away from me. It's available for rent now. So the next day, it was available to go look at it. I emailed the landlord. They said, oh, come on in. I went in. I saw the space. As soon as I walked in, I knew I needed to have it. I knew it was mine because of the light, because of the location. I just knew in my gut this was the studio for me. And I'd already been talking about it with my coach/mentor. I had already been talking about it with my husband, then fiance at the time. And I brought my fiance with me to go look at the space. And I think we both knew as soon as we walked in, like, oh, this is happening. This is happening. And this was really scary because I basically said to him, like, look, I want to quit my job. I want to sign this lease and I want to do my photography business full time. So not only was I forfeiting my steady salary, I also was like, let me just take on this extra expense of $3,000 a month. And, I wouldn't recommend doing that. If I could go back, I don't know. I'm pretty sure I would definitely do it again. But this is just how it worked out for me. I'm not saying that this is the way to do it, that you should take on this expense, but I'll tell you why I came to this conclusion. I am an Enneagram type 6. If you're not familiar with the Enneagram system, that means I like to have a plan and a contingency plan for everything. I have spreadsheets for everything. There is a plan for everything. And I said to myself, okay, I had enough savings in place such that if this flopped belly up, whatever, I could still pay rent and not go into debt. I don't like to be in debt. I didn't want to take out a loan. I didn't want to do any of that. So that was one pro for the studio. The second pro was that the landlord offered me a 1-year lease, which is not very common in commercial real estate. Usually you are signing on for 3 to 5 years, but my landlord was super duper chill. He offered it to me for a year. So I said, okay, well, if it doesn't work out for this year, I'll just go back. So that was really the deciding factor, the fact that I didn't have to sign on for multiple years and I had the flexibility to back out if I needed to. This is what put me over the edge to say, okay, it's freaking now or never. Was it terrifying? Absolutely. Did I have 6 months of bookings lined up when I quit like I had originally imagined? No. But again, I did have enough savings so that I could cover the new cost of the studio plus my existing living expenses if things went south. And I had already done the math on what it would take to rent out this studio to help cover the cost of rent. So again, I don't know if I would necessarily recommend taking on this approach. This is just what happened to me. And I'm grateful that I had enough in savings from my corporate job to be able to handle this. So let's fast forward to the end of 2021. I had $130,000 in gross revenue, so 6 figures, woohoo. However, that equated to $58,000 in profit that I took home right after expenses. Not after taxes, but after expenses. So remember, just because you make six figures in sales does not mean you actually take home six figures. My goal was to take home six figures. So that was 2021. Lots of craziness. I really went from 0 to 100. I hustled really, really hard. I worked a lot of hours to make this happen. And I'm happy with the outcome. However, working half the year, so I quit in June. That gave me about 6 months of working full time. I was like, okay, next year it's going to be the year. This is going to be the year that I hit my goal. So 2022 was my first full calendar year from January to December as a full-time photographer, and I did hit my goal. I made six figures in profit, not just in revenue, but in take-home pay. So from 2018 to 2022, or end of 2022, it took me 5 years to get there, but it happened. So now that you've been through the timeline of the beginning of my business to my best year yet, let's talk about the costs. So this is looking at 2022. I'll explain why we're looking at 2022 and not 2023 later. I moved across the country, but in 2022, I, again, took home about 50%. So I operated at about 50% profit margin, which means for every dollar that I brought in, I would keep 50 cents, right? So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Neither nor. A 50% profit margin is what worked for me. That might be vastly different for you depending on the type of business that you run. Also keep in mind, right, I have a studio. Huge, huge expense that a lot of people don't have. I know people that run photography businesses at like an 85% profit margin. So they're only, spending 15% of what they bring in on expenses. That's awesome. You have to figure out for you what makes sense. I can't be, the source of truth on that. It's going to depend for you. So I'll tell you what I spent my money on, and you can decide if that's something that you need or didn't need. What matters is not that your profit margin matches mine. What matters is that it aligns with your goals and your lifestyle. So for me in 2022, I chose to invest heavily in growing my team because my word for the year in 2022 was scalability. We'll get into that in another episode. But at the time, I had a copywriter, a virtual assistant, an editor, lots of really amazing people who helped me run the MLA Kim photography, brand photography business. So could my profit margin have been higher had I did everything myself? Absolutely. But again, at this point in time, that wasn't the business that I wanted to run. And my goal was to grow. I wanted to bring on a team of contractors. That's what I mean when I say team. I don't have employees. So let's break down where the money came from, the revenue streams. Number one, obviously, photography services. Number two, I have studio rentals, right? So I would rent out my studio, the Sunlight space. It's not my studio anymore, but I would rent it out by the hour to help cover the cost of rent. I also had a little bit of consulting and some digital products. So let's go into how much came from each service. Let me pull open my profit and loss statement. Okay, so as expected, the majority of my income came from photography services. My total revenue for the year, let me give you that first, was $246,034. That was how much I brought in total. And of that, $187,935 came from photography services alone. So I know at least when I hear people have income claims, they're like, well, how much is coming from education? Most of this came from one-on-one photography services. That was the biggest chunk of income. The next highest portion of revenue came from the Sunlight space hourly rentals, so renting out my studio to other photographers and creatives. And that comes in at $49,665. Most of that went to rent and other studio expenses. We'll get into that in a minute. And then some of my smaller revenue streams. So I do a little bit of one-on-one like mentoring and consulting. I do a lot more of it now, but at the time I was just getting started in it. Total for consulting and strategy and mentoring was $5,566. And then the last revenue stream was my online shop, so digital products. I have a goal setting guide, I have presets, I had a course on how to take brand photos with your phone. That came out to $2,558. So just because you make a course, it does not mean you're going to sell them like hotcakes. It is not going to be passive revenue right away. Let me just set that straight right now. I don't even sell a couple of these courses anymore because it was just taking away my attention from booking photography services. So just to level set with you, most of my money came from photography. So it is possible. When I first started my business in 2018, I did not even believe or could fathom that this was possible. But it so is. Okay, so that is the revenue. Now let's get into the costs of where the money actually goes. We're going to look at the two main categories. Number one is your costs of goods sold, or my cost of goods sold, which is things like assistants on sets, editors, space rentals, hair and makeup artists, expenses that are directly tied to a specific photography booking, right? I would not hire a hair and makeup artist if I did not have a photo session. That's the cost of goods sold. The second category of expenses are your operating expenses. And this is stuff that keeps the business running from day to day. We're talking like my bookkeeping fees, virtual assistant, software, website expenses, all of that fun stuff. So we're just going to go through this. I'll pull out the major line items. So we're going to start with cost of goods sold. So my total cost of goods sold was $23,050. A lot of that went to hair and makeup. So I spent a little over $10,000 with hair and makeup artists. So the way that that works is my clients will book me. I build in the cost of hair and makeup into my services, and then I contract out hair and makeup to my preferred stylists. The next highest costs of goods sold are assistant photographers. If I need like a second photographer for any kind of reason, that came out to about $5,500. My next highest expenses are space rentals. So if I had a client who wanted to rent a space, a separate studio, but didn't use the Sunlight space, my studio, then I would just handle the booking for that to make it as easy as possible for them. And that came out to about $3,900. Other things are editing, more editing, photo editing. That's pretty much it. So that's the cost of goods sold. Now, if we come down to my operating expenses, right, which are costs that I would incur to market my own business, things that I would have regardless of the type of service that I offer. If we take a look, the highest category was contractors, of course, because like I said, I have a lot of people. That came out to $18,606. The contractors that I had were a bookkeeper, a couple of copywriters. I had a Pinterest manager. I had a virtual assistant. I think I hired a couple of people for like strategy sessions. So that is what is included in contractors. Next up, I'm just going down the list now. We had branding and marketing, which is, what is this? Oh, more copywriters, which came to around $10,000. Well, what is this? Copywriters plus, I hired someone to do a brand strategy guide for me this year. We also have credit card processing fees. Listen here, your Stripe fees, PayPal fees, Square fees, they're a cost of doing business. That came out to $6,462. I just ignore it. I don't even look at it, because if you want to run a legitimate business and you want to make it easy for your clients to pay you, that's the cost of it. Stripe has to get paid. PayPal has to get paid. Sure, some of them have higher fees than other. It's marginal. I use Stripe because I like it. Just don't even look at it. Know that it is a built-in cost of doing business. And please don't say, oh, well, I only take cash or Venmo or whatever. Make it easy on your clients, okay? So credit card processing fees. Coming down here, we also have equipment. So I spent around $2,700 in camera, gear, equipment. What else? A next big line item is props. So I spent about $2,000 in props for the studio, likely. I had about $15,000 in startup costs when I opened the studio. I did end up making that back within the first full year of being on the lease. My next expense, of course, is rent, which is the highest category, a total of $33,630 for the year. But if we go back to look at how much I made in rentals, I brought in $49,000 in rentals. I spent $33,000 on rent, plus some other stuff on props. Not a huge profit margin, but again, for me to have a studio that I can use basically for free, that's mine, and also make a little bit of money, it was awesome. I'll do a whole other deep dive on the trials and tribulations of running a studio. If you want it, please just let me know. But like it was worth it, but also know that it does take work to rent it out. It's a whole other different business. What else? About $4,800 in software, $10,000 in training and education. Okay, I want to talk about this. This year in 2022, I definitely overspent in education. There were a couple of things that I bought that I got sucked into the marketing, right? They were great courses. I use this example of a LinkedIn course that I bought. It was a really good course, but I didn't need it. I have not really marketed on LinkedIn. I have that knowledge now, but did I need to spend as much money as I did on this course? Definitely not. So always remember to keep your goals in mind when you're looking at education and courses. Really ask yourself, is this something that I need that's going to further my business, or am I getting sucked into the marketing? Just keep that in mind. $10,000 in education, definitely overspent that year. And then the last couple of things, around $1,500 on travel because I had a couple of travel gigs, and $1,600 in utilities for the studio. So when it's all said and done, that brought my net income for my photography business in 2022. So that's revenue minus expenses to $123,681 and some change. So that is the overview on what it cost me to run my business and how I ran my business. I also want to point out a couple of things. So in November of 2022, I actually had a loss. I had a loss of $2,137. That's not saying I had a negative bank account, but what that's saying is more money went out than came in. I had business savings, right? So I didn't go in the red in terms of that. And this really freaked me out at first. I was like, oh my gosh, I started spiraling. I'm a terrible business owner. How could I be in the red? Blah, 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 blah. But because at this point I was working with the bookkeeper monthly and I got these reports monthly, I knew, okay, well, in November of 2022, I did a lot of traveling. I took like pretty much the whole month off from my business. So this makes sense. My business at the time was not set up for me to leave for this amount of time. So I wasn't shooting. I didn't have any sessions. I wasn't really marketing. I wasn't really doing anything. So yeah, of course, this makes total sense. And when you look at your profit and loss statement regularly, you can know these things about yourself, right? So I did freak out about it. I did spiral. It has happened a couple of times since then, maybe like once or twice a year, but I'm not freaking out about it because I know now around November, December, things get a little bit slower, and that's normal, and that's okay. But like I said, this was 2022. I didn't give you a deep dive on 2023 because I actually moved my business across the country. I can do a whole other deep dive episode about this. It's already on my YouTube channel. But I moved my business across the country. I did still profit, so my end numbers looked like $176,000-ish in gross revenue, and then I took home a little less than half of that, so $93,000-ish. So I'm still happy with those numbers, but I totally changed the way that I run my business because I moved across the country. So that's why we're going over 2022 instead of 2023. So 2022 was me operating my business as a full-time photographer without any major changes in my life. What are the big takeaways here? Number one is to know that your business growth is likely not going to be linear. It's going to change. You're going to have ups and downs. And the key to being a successful business owner is knowing that this is going to happen and knowing how to ride the roller coaster without freaking out so much. I still freak out. You can obviously still freak out, but I think the key is to lessen those freakouts over time. The second big takeaway is to know your goals. So what kind of lifestyle do you want to live? How much money do you need to make that lifestyle happen? You got to know your goals. And then from there, we can reverse engineer how you want to run your business and how much money your business needs to make for you to be able to live that lifestyle. I actually have a pricing calculator on exactly how to do this. It's called the photography pricing calculator, but it really works for anyone that's a one-on-one service provider. If you have any questions, just DM me on Instagram. I will leave the link to that in the show notes, but it is really, really crucial. If you've never done this exercise before of reverse engineering what your project minimum should be, this calculator walks you through that. So I'll leave the link in the show notes. And then the next big takeaway is to keep track of your numbers. It's okay to be scared. You know that I was absolutely horrified of it at first, but what really helped me was hiring a bookkeeper. So she's so amazing. She came in, she does all my numbers, delivers this beautiful report in my inbox so that I am not in the weeds of like categorizing expenses, right? I just see the high level report. That really helped me break down that barrier in my brain of it being scary. It was actually really exciting because then when I would get the report back from her, I would see like, oh, this is a really great month. What did I do differently in this month that made this happen? Like what happened in my business that caused these results? And over time, it just became less and less scary. So keep track of your numbers, hire a bookkeeper if you need to. The next thing is to invest in your business, but do it strategically. Don't buy things just for the marketing hype. Really take the time to evaluate if an investment in your business is going to move the needle forward or not. My next lesson is to be patient. I literally just laid out my entire business for you. I feel a little bit naked about it, but it took me 5 years to hit 6 figures in profit, and that's okay. And I'm happy with that. Success doesn't happen overnight. I really think I could have gotten there faster had I taken some of this advice, right? If I didn't spend so much money in the beginning on useless things that I really didn't need. And if I had looked at my numbers earlier, I think I would have come to this realization faster. So just be patient and know that it doesn't happen overnight, despite what you see on social media, people saying that like, it happened overnight for me, so it can happen overnight for you too. I mean, it can. It 100% can. But it didn't for me. And then finally, don't compare your journey to others. Your path is your path. It's unique. You live a different life than me. I don't have kids, so my schedule looks different from you. If you do have kids, we all have different schedules and responsibilities and obligations that we have. It's all going to be different, and that's a good thing. So I hope sharing this story and my numbers along the way gives you a realistic picture of what running a creative business looks like. This is what I wish that I had when I first started running my business, and it just wasn't available to me. So I hope this roadmap is helpful. And no, it's not like a step-by-step journey. Yours is not going to look exactly like mine. It's not always glamorous, but I hope that this is helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to join the Profitable Creatives Facebook group. It's free. It's a private group. I let people in manually, so it might be a couple of days before you get in, but I would love, love, love to hear your thoughts, any takeaways that you have, or any advice that you have on your own journey. Or if you have anything that you want to share, I would love to hear it in the Profitable Creatives Facebook group. I'll leave the link in the show notes. And that's all I have for now. Head to the free Facebook group. I'm also on Instagram at emilykim.co. And seeing as this is a new podcast, if you really enjoyed this episode, I would really love if you could rate and review this podcast. Tell me what your thoughts are. Follow it too if you want to keep hearing from me. It is really helpful to get seen by other creatives that might need this information. I would really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next episode.